Good evening, brethren, and welcome to Burlingame Lodge number 400's Masonic guest speaker presentation. This is now our 8th speaker in our speaker series. Time flies when you're having a good time. My name again is Roberto Diaz Jr. I'm the repeating worshipful master of Burlingame Lodge number 400 in Burlingame, California. On behalf of our lodge, I'd like to offer a great big fraternal welcome to all. We're very pleased to have you here again, and like Worshipful Marty was saying, we do have a lot of returnees, so really appreciate that. Before we start, we will have our benediction. Brother Aidan Carter, our chaplain, will lead us in prayer, please. Brother Chaplain.
Thank you, Worshipful. Brothers, I would ask that you would bow your head in prayer. Great Architect of the universe, in thy name we have assembled, and in thy name we desire to proceed in all our doings. Grant that the sublime principles of Freemasonry may so subdue every discordant passion within us, so harmonize and enrich with thine own love and goodness, that the lodge at this time may humbly reflect that order and beauty which reign forever before thy throne. Amen.
So mote it be. Brethren, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of our country. Worshipful Brother Gary Stevens will lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Helping us here tonight, again, we have, as he introduced himself, Worshipful Brother Marty Kusing. We have also Worshipful Brother Gary Stevens, Worshipful Brother David Jolliffe. All these brothers are past masters of Burlingame Lodge number 400. And we have Brother Aidan Carter, our chaplain, and we have our junior warden, Brother Barry Kopp, also joining us there tonight. So without further ado, brethren, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to our lecture series, Very Worshipful Allan Casalou, past master. Worshipful Casalou is a true native of California. He was born, raised, and went to college and post-grad school here. He joined Masonry in 1991 and was raised that same year in Merced Lodge number 749. He's a past master of Alcalani's Fellowship Lodge number 480, Prometheus Lodge number, and Prometheus Lodge number 851. Brother Allan is well known to all California Masons as he is the Grand Secretary of Freemasons in California. He was elected to this position for the first time in 2008. Very Worshipful also serves as secretary to several operational and charitable boards, including Masonic Homes of California and the California Masonic Foundation. He is the chief executive of the California Masonic Memorial Temple and the Nob Hill Masonic Center. Since 2002, Brother Allan has been the editor of the award-winning California Freemason magazine. Worshipful Casalou is a 33rd degree Scottish Rite member, a York Rite member, and a member of the Shrine. Very Worshipful Brother Allan will be presenting this evening Earl Warren, the Man, the Mason, the Chief Justice. Very Worshipful Allan, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Worshipful Roberto, and good evening, brethren. What a real pleasure it is to be with you here tonight. Burlingame Lodge for a number of years has been so kind to extend invitations to me to come and speak to the lodge, and I've enjoyed every one. And tonight, as we're able to meet in this virtual environment, I'm honored really once again. You should be so proud of your lodge for its commitment to all aspects of Masonry, but certainly Masonic education. Burlingame Lodge stands out as one of the lodges that really excels in providing a good experience for its members in terms of Masonic education. And I'm just so pleased to be here tonight to talk about one of our brothers who came before us and who I think sets a very good example for Masons who take seriously the obligation that we should work every day to improve ourselves so that we can help others. and to demonstrate these virtues that we teach and practice in Masonry, to inculcate them into our daily lives. And tonight we're going to talk about one of our brothers who has been an incredible example in that regard. In my view, probably the most influential American Mason in the 20th century, and that is Brother Earl Warren. I'm going to share my screen here so that we can watch this PowerPoint as we move through this presentation. And as you have questions, as you heard Brother Marty say earlier, feel free to put them in the chat. I love the questions, and I've worked to make sure that we'll have time for these questions in the end. But let's get right to it so we can get to those questions. Earl Warren.
Very worshipful. If I can pause for a second, I think there's something that might be hitting your microphone, something scratching a little bit.
There we go. Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
So Earl Warren wore a number of badges in his life, ranging from the uniform he wore as a first lieutenant in the United States Army to the badge he carried as the district attorney of Alameda County, to the apron he wore as a Mason, and to the robe that he wore as Chief Justice of the United States. Each of these badges carried certain authority, responsibilities, obligations, traditions. Tonight, we will focus on two of Earl Warren's badges, the white Masonic apron and the black judicial robe. The white apron, of course, is familiar to all of us as Masons. It originated from the aprons worn by stoneworking Masons. And to us as Freemasons, the apron is an emblem of innocence and the badge of a Mason. Earl Warren received his Masonic apron over 100 years ago on October 11th, 1919, when he was elected, or rather initiated, an entered apprentice Mason in Sequoia Lodge number 349 in Oakland. Warren applied to receive the degrees of Masonry a month earlier on September 2nd, 1919, and he was elected to membership on October 7. But actually, this was the second time Warren had petitioned the lodge. He submitted his first application 3 years earlier in October of 1916, but on that occasion, his application was rejected. As you know, the election of an applicant to receive the degrees of Masonry requires a unanimous vote of the lodge. Having been rejected, or blackballed, as it is sometimes called, at least one member of Sequoia Lodge was not ready to admit Warren into Freemasonry in 1916. I don't know the reason for his rejection, but it's clear that whatever the reason, it was resolved by 1919 when Warren joined the ranks of Freemasonry and became a notable part of our history. Earl Warren was an engaged, enthusiastic, and dedicated Freemason. I point this out because there are other Masons who are well known in history, but who were not very involved or only passively involved in Freemasonry. This was not the case with Earl Warren. Earl Warren quickly advanced through the degrees of Masonry. He received his second degree on October 16th, 1919, and his third degree on November 1st, 1919. This tells me that he had a good memory, right? He was a quick study, and he had a substantial desire to progress through the degrees of Masonry. There's a good deal of work, as you know, that a candidate for the degrees has to memorize and recite back to each other in an open lodge before he can receive the next degree. Warren would not have been able to advance as quickly as he did without dedicating several hours every day to the study of this work. Warren was an officer of the lodge for 7 years, serving as master in 1928. That same year, he was elected president of the Masters and Past Masters Association of Alameda County, which demonstrates that the fraternity's leaders in that county held him in high esteem. He was involved in the concordant bodies of Freemasonry and took on leadership positions there. He was potentate of Amish Shriners in 1933 and venerable master of Oakland Scottish Rite bodies in 1945. If you're aware of his political history, this means he was venerable master when he was governor of California. He served Grand Lodge on a number of committees and was elected the Grand Master of Masons in 1935, serving through October of 1936. And though he went on to positions of great influence in state and federal government, Warren continued his relationship with his lodge, often serving as installing officer for the annual installation of officers, even when he was governor. I never met Earl Warren, but because of our Masonic ties, I feel like I understand him. While we lived in different times and led very different lives, we're both Masons, and I find the bonds of fraternity very strong between us. As I've read about his life and having had the opportunity to read some of his own words as our Grand Master and as Chief Justice, I observe the core principles of Freemasonry embodied in the way he lived his life, the way he acted, and the judgment he exercised on the Supreme Court. I want to share a few examples of these observations with you. I do not intend to establish a cause and effect relationship between his membership and leadership in Freemasonry and his history-making actions on the Supreme Court, nor will I attempt any historical or legal analysis of his work. I'm sure you're relieved by that. I simply want to point out what I recognize as Masonic principles reflected in his work. Why is this important to me? Why would it be important to any Mason? Because as Masons, we are taught and we each personally strive to practice the principles of Masonry in our daily lives, to find ways to translate these very well-written words on a page into intentional and obvious behaviors in our lives. This is not an easy thing to do. But when we see that a man such as Warren was able to accomplish it, we're inspired to continue our efforts to improve ourselves and do good for others. I want to refocus now on a period of Warren's Masonic membership from 1919 to 1929. During these 10 years, Warren went to lodge nearly every Tuesday night. He served in nearly every office in the lodge. This means he memorized a significant portion of the ritual during this period. Sequoia Lodge received hundreds of applications for membership in this time. In fact, they read between 5 and 15 applications every month. The lodge was very busy conferring degrees, and the meeting minutes and the Tyler's Register of Sequoia Lodge reveal that Warren himself performed hundreds of degrees during that 10-year period. Warren memorized and delivered over and over again the teachings of Freemasonry when he was between the ages of 28 and 38, likely very formative years in his adult life. Like Warren, and like many of you, I have also memorized much of this same ritual over the last 30 years. I have performed it more than 100 times myself. I find this work and the repetition of the work useful, especially during times of crisis or challenge. I tap into this ritual. I recite the words to myself, and I'm caused to remember the important principles they imply. It helps me gain perspective. It clears my mind. and gives me an idea of what is right and what is important. In reflecting back upon his days in Sequoia Lodge, Earl Warren wrote a letter to the lodge master, Owen Anchor, on October 11, 1952, from the governor's office in Sacramento. My own membership in Sequoia Lodge, Earl Warren wrote, has given me many enriching experiences. The lessons I learned in the 3 degrees of the craft have guided me through many difficult situations, and I have always been sustained by the fraternal affection of our brethren. Many of the lessons of the craft are found in the several passages of the ritual, which help shape our thinking and guide our actions. Here are just a few passages from Masonic ceremonies that particularly resonate with me as being consistent with Earl Warren's most important work. The first passage describes one of the 3 principal tenets of Freemasonry, brotherly love. By the exercise of brotherly love, we are taught to regard the whole human species as one family, the high and the low, the rich and the poor, who, as created by one almighty parent and as inhabitants of the same planet, are to aid, support, and protect each other. This is the description of one of the working tools of the 2nd degree used in the installation ceremony. The level, my brother, demonstrates that we are all descended of the same stock, that we partake of the same nature, and that we share the same hope, and that although distinctions among men are necessary to preserve subordination, yet no eminence of station should make us forget that we are brethren. For he who is placed on the lowest spoke of fortune's wheel is entitled to our regard. And this last passage describes one of Freemasonry's 4 cardinal virtues, justice. Justice is that standard or boundary of right, which enables us to render unto every man his just due without distinction. These represent just a small sample of the ritual Warren studied, memorized, and conveyed to others in his lodge. These principles are obvious to me in his life and work. Total equality and respect for all, regardless of one's station in life. Fairness and concern for those less capable or less fortunate. As Masons, we believe that equality is achieved when all people have access to the same information and have the same opportunity to learn and grow and make a difference. We believe we have an obligation to level the playing field by elevating everyone to the same plane. I see these ideas come alive time and again in Earl Warren's life and work. Let me provide a few examples from the written work of the Chief Justice in 3 of his well-known, or let's say landmark, cases. Miranda versus Arizona. In 1966, the Supreme Court considered whether it was necessary to embed certain protections into the process of custodial interrogations to ensure that a citizen's Fifth Amendment right to avoid self-incrimination was properly preserved. As we know, the court decided that, in fact, specific notice must be given to those who are taken into custody. They have the right to remain silent and that they have the right to legal counsel. The court ordered that those in custody must be warned that anything they say can be used against them in a trial, and that counsel will be provided to them at no cost if they cannot otherwise afford counsel. This notice is now known as the Miranda Warning. We've all heard it, maybe not in actual custody, but we have heard you have the right to remain silent and so on. Some have made the observation that this and similar decisions by the Warren Court reflect the Chief Justice's negative view of law enforcement, a view that he acquired after a long tenure as the District Attorney of Alameda County and as Attorney General of the state of California. There might be some merit to this observation. There is no doubt Earl Warren saw some of the best and some of the worst law enforcement practices during his service. There is also plenty written into this decision to support the fact that he had a vast knowledge of how evidence is obtained in criminal cases. As a Mason, however, I see certain other principles in this decision. Principles not targeted at law enforcement, but principles of fairness, justice, and concern for mankind, especially those in need or at a disadvantage. In reading this decision, I am caused to remember our Masonic obligation to give a man due and timely notice if he is in danger of injury to his person or good name. I notice an effort to bring all people to the same plane, giving them all the same information. I notice a search for that boundary of right that will render unto every man his just due without distinction. In the decision, Warren wrote, "The need for counsel in order to protect the Fifth Amendment privilege exists for the indigent as well as the affluent. In fact, were we to limit these constitutional rights to those who can retain an attorney, our decisions today would be of little significance. The cases before us, as well as the vast majority of confession cases in which we have dealt in the past, involve those unable to retain counsel. While authorities are not required to relieve the accused of poverty, they do have an obligation not to take advantage of indigence in the administration of justice. In this decision, I observe a man who regarded the whole human species as one family, the high and the low, the rich and the poor, who are to aid, support, and protect each other." Hernandez versus Casalou. This case involved the systematic exclusion of persons of Mexican descent from serving as jurors, although there were such persons fully qualified to serve in Jackson County, Texas, where Pete Hernandez stood trial for murder. The Supreme Court reversed the decision of the lower courts and declared that the Constitution entitled Hernandez and all defendants the right to be indicted and tried by juries selected from among all qualified persons, regardless of national origin or descent. Warren wrote the opinion of the court. In it, he expressed the idea that prejudice is in constant motion, that it is subject to change, that one prejudice could be cured, but another might arise. This is what he wrote. "Throughout our history, differences in race and color have defined easily identifiable groups, which at times have required the aid of the courts in securing equal treatment under the law. But community prejudices are not static, and from time to time, other differences from the community norm may define other groups, which will need the same protection. When the existence of a distinct class is demonstrated, and it is further shown that the laws as written or applied single out that class for different treatment, not based on some reasonable classification, the guarantees of the Constitution have been violated." Warren helps me in this writing understand that prejudice won't end with a war, a single piece of legislation, or a treaty. The human existence is constantly evolving, and we must be aware that prejudice will also evolve. Even if we work to level the playing field today, tomorrow may require us to level it again. Perhaps this is why Masons say we must be ever willing to stretch forth a helping hand to raise those who have fallen. Perhaps this is why Masons judge the internal and not the external qualities of man. Masons are taught that the only meaningful distinction among mankind is whether one intends to do good or not. The installation ceremony reminds us that the time will come, and the wisest know not how soon, when all distinction, save that of goodness, shall cease, and death, the mighty leveler of human greatness, reduce us to the same state. The importance of public education was a popular topic inside Masonic lodges from the time Warren was initiated to the time he served as Grand Master. In 1920, just months after Warren became a Freemason, Grand Master Charles Adams created Public Schools Week, requiring all lodges in California to become aware of the needs of public schools in their community and to do whatever they could do to address those needs. Public Schools Week has been observed by Masons every year since. Today it is known as Public Schools Month, and last year we celebrated the 100th anniversary of this important observance. Year after year, Warren and his brothers were caused to be informed about the state of public schools in Oakland and directed to promote the school's best interest in that community. In 1928, as master of the lodge, Warren was responsible to see that Sequoia Lodge observed Public Schools Week. He took this obligation seriously. Warren wrote a short article in each month's trestle board, then a pocket-sized newsletter with the lodge calendar for the month. In the April 1928 issue, Warren wrote about their upcoming Public Schools Week event. Every Mason should have some intimate knowledge of the organization and functions of our public schools, he wrote. The Honorable Alexander F. Herron, Director of Finances of California, is at the present time perhaps most familiar with such matters than any other man in the state. He will talk to us on the reorganization of the State Department of Education. The observance of Public Schools Week has become an established Masonic institution, and it is hoped that the Brothers of Sequoia Lodge will lend their presence in order to make our meeting worthy of its cause. It was important to Warren that Public Schools Week address the real issues facing school children, and that it not simply be a social activity. When he was Grand Master, he was responsible for the statewide observance of Public Schools Week. This observance was important enough to Warren that in his 1936 Grand Master's address to the Grand Lodge, he wrote, "I note with interest that there was widespread observance of our 17th annual Public Schools Week. It is so gratifying to know that another jurisdiction, Georgia, initiated a similar observance this year. It is also of note that as time passes, Public Schools Week is becoming more of a civic affair than formally, and that greater emphasis is now being placed upon presenting to the general public a real picture of the activities of school life of the children, rather than upon mere entertainment." In an interesting turn of events, Warren was appointed Chief Justice in October 1953, just as the Supreme Court was hearing arguments in the case known as Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka et al. In Brown, Warren and the court considered the question of whether segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprived children of the minority group of equal education opportunities. We know the court believed it did. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that segregated educational facilities are inherently unequal and deprive the minority students of equal protection under the law. Warren wrote the opinion of the court and described the drafting process this way. I assigned myself to write the decision, for it seemed to me that something so important ought to issue over the name of the Chief Justice of the United States. In drafting it, I sought to use low-key, unemotional language and keep it short enough so that it could be published in full in every newspaper in the country. I kept the text secret. It was locked in my safe until I read it from the bench. This is not the complete decision, but listen to these words written by the Chief Justice in the Brown decision describing his view of education. Today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education in a democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even in service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Today, it is a principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to adjust normally to his environment. In these days, it is doubtful that any child may be reasonably expected to succeed if he is denied the opportunity of an education. Such opportunity, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. I believe that these words represent Warren's personal thoughts about education. Why do I believe this? First, because his handwritten draft of this opinion is available to view, and it's very close to the final version. So we know he wrote it himself. Second, because these thoughts are nearly identical to the thoughts Grand Master Warren shared with his brethren during his address at the 1936 annual communication. In this report, he did not feel the same need to use low-key and unemotional language. Here is what Earl Warren wrote about public education when he was Grand Master of Masons of California 18 years before the Brown decision. The more I see life, the more firmly I am convinced that the hope of the future lies in the education of youth, not of some children, but of all children, not according to so-called classes of society, but according to a wisely conceived and efficiently executed plan that will make available to every child, regardless of his station in life, an equal opportunity to study, learn, and progress on his own merits. In this complicated and ever-changing world, this can be done. Indeed, it can only be done by a system of free public education. It is for this reason that the Grand Lodge of California, ever striving as it does to replace darkness with light, is so vitally interested in the public schools of our state. One of the greatest leavening influences in society today is the public schools. It does more to break down distinctions between social and economic groups and to eliminate class consciousness than any other man-made institution. It offers the strongest proof to the world that he who is placed on the lowest spoke of fortune's wheel may be entitled to our regard. By destroying prejudice and planting reason in its place, it prepares the foundation of a liberty-loving people, the greatest blessing this or any nation has ever had. It seems to me that Warren was quite prepared for the Brown decision when he joined the court in 1953. He spent decades considering the implications of equality in public education. Indeed, just as Grand Master Warren advocated in 1936, the Brown decision of 1954 planted reason in place of prejudice and laid the foundation for equality in school environments. As New York Times obituarist Alden Whitman noted in his 1974 obituary of the Chief Justice, from the Brown decision flowed a score or more by the court and by inferior courts that collectively struck down racial inequalities in most areas of public life. As a result, parks, swimming pools, bus terminals, and housing were desegregated. Whitman said, among other things, the Warren Court enunciated the one man, one vote rule, underscored the right to a jury trial, said that wages could not be garnished without warning or a hearing, and made most of the Bill of Rights binding upon the states. Earl Warren had many titles in his life. He served many different terms of office. One of his longest tenures was his 55 years as a Mason. Edward Sims, one of my predecessors as Grand Secretary and a past Grand Master of our Grand Lodge, was interviewed in 1970 about his relationship with Earl Warren shortly after the Chief Justice retired from the Supreme Court. In the interview, Sims indicates that Warren's interest in Freemasonry was still strong in 1970. He said, since he resigned as Chief Justice of the United States, he told me that the teachings of Masonry have been an influence in his life throughout his whole legal career. I usually see Earl Warren in Washington every February. We have dinner together when I go there to Masonic conferences. And he seems hungry to find out what's going on in Masonry in California. He happens to be in California now. He called me up last week and said, Ed, I'm coming over to have lunch with you or just sit down to talk for a little while. So I know that he has maintained his interest all these years. Sims went on to reflect on Earl Warren as a Mason, and he said, I think one of the most outstanding features of Earl Warren's Masonic career was not only his devotion to Masonry and to the individual Mason, but the fact that he was willing to help anyone, and he seemed to seek out the one that needed help. Earl Warren died on July 9th, 1974. His legacy is large. He means so much to so many different people. To me, as a Mason, he is an inspiration. His life is proof that we can, each one of us, practice out of the lodge those great moral duties which are inculcated in it. Thank you.
Thank you, very worshipful. Really enjoyed that. I thought I knew who Earl Warren was. I'm glad you definitely enlightened me and were able to share your research with us. I believe we have some questions already within the brethren. Brother Worshipful Gary, do you have something for us? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Worshipful Allan. That was really good. You had mentioned Sequoia Lodge several times, and Brother Warren was a past master, and you were able to, it looks like you were able to find a few trestle boards during his time there. Is Sequoia Lodge still a chartered lodge? I don't remember ever hearing anything about it.
Sequoia Lodge merged with other lodges, and today is Pleasanton Lodge.
Okay.
Number 321.
Okay. Okay, next question. This is more of a political question. but I will ask it. Earl Warren was a proponent of internment during World War II. I understand subsequently that he had great remorse about his support. In any of your research, did you come across this at all?
Oh, sure. It's a fact of Earl Warren's life that one cannot overlook in looking at his entire life. During the Second World War, he was Attorney General of California, and it was his job to carry out President Roosevelt's order to intern Japanese Americans in California. And later in his life, he talked about the regret he had over his involvement in that. He felt in hindsight that the decision was hasty and that they allowed their fear to influence their decisions. So, it's an example of the journey that we're all on. And this was an opportunity for Earl Warren to demonstrate that he was still on that journey in his life and able to look back and see the things that he could have done differently. So it's a good question, and it's definitely a part of his story.
Okay, thank you. Can you talk a bit about worship?
Oh, sorry, Gary. Can I add in really quickly? Just want to remind all the attendees that you can click the Q&A button, or you can write your question in the chat, and Gary can help present those questions.
Okay, next question from Brother Robert White. Can you talk a little bit about Worshipful Brother Warren, how he uses Masonic background and philosophy to obtain a unanimous decision on the Brown versus Board of Education, especially with a former KKK member, Justice Hugo Black, on the Supreme Court?
Yes, I think Earl Warren developed a lot of skills in his life, and consensus building was obviously one of them. I think he still remains the only gubernatorial candidate in California that received the nomination of both political parties. He was a man that brought people together, and certainly we can point to all the concepts and principles in Masonry that encourage us to do this and emphasize the importance of consensus building and collaboration. But he did work hard in the Brown decision because he felt so strongly that the country needed a unanimous decision. And he worked individually with each of his colleagues on the Supreme Court to hear them out and be sure that their views were reflected in this decision that was written. And most people were stunned at the time that it was a 9-0 decision.
Thank you. Okay, next question. My understanding is that Earl Warren disliked Nixon intensely. Can you expand on that at all, and the Watergate affair?
Well, I mean, of course, I don't have the benefit of any private conversations with Earl Warren, but I think it's fair to say, on balance, having read a lot about his life, that he really didn't have enemies. He was very careful not to burn bridges. So I doubt that he considered Nixon an enemy in any way. They were political, they competed against one another in the political arena. And as a matter of fact, that is what led to Earl Warren becoming the Chief Justice. As you might know, Earl Warren was Dewey's vice presidential candidate who ran against Truman. And so Earl Warren came very close to being vice president of the United States. And most people don't remember that. But he was a powerhouse in the Republican Party in the nation. And he decided to run for president again when Eisenhower ran. And Eisenhower, of course, had made a deal with Nixon. And the famous conversation I think that people point to is the and it's all rumored at this point, but it's a conversation between Nixon and Warren. They were both from California, of course. And Nixon convinced Warren to withdraw from the competition and to give his delegates to Truman. And the agreement was that the first position on the Supreme Court would be given to Warren if he did that. And lo and behold, Eisenhower was elected, became president, and the first person to resign from the Supreme Court just a few months later was the Chief Justice, which I don't think Nixon or Eisenhower were planning. But that's the story. And so they were, colleagues and fellow Californians. I think it's clear they didn't view the world the same way, but I don't know that they were really enemies, because I don't think Earl Warren viewed anyone as an enemy.
Okay, next question. Did Earl Warren have a Masonic family legacy before he was a Mason or after?
No, I do not. I haven't come across any information that would lead me to believe that Earl Warren's family before him were Masons. I know his grandson, who lives here in Napa County, and I know that he's not a Mason. He's thought about it, and I don't know of any other Masons in his family. Earl Warren was himself very, very active in Masonry. I mentioned a lot of his work, but some of you might be members of the Northern California Research Lodge. Earl Warren was a founding member of that lodge, and he was governor when that lodge was created. He attended every annual communication except for one, from the time he was master of his lodge until he moved out of California to go work on the Supreme Court. He was just very active in Masonry. And I think for maybe his sons, Freemasonry seemed like something that might take up too much of one's life. I don't know, but I don't know that his sons became Masons.
Okay. Next question. Most worshipful Earl Warren as Grand Master of California, what was his most notable accomplishment during his year, both for California Masonry and Masonry in Hawaii?
Yeah, that's a good question. When you read the proceedings of 1936, that's where you're going to find this information. Earl Warren acted upon a good number of different issues that were confronting the fraternity. Imagine we're just coming out of the Depression. There were also issues around drinking, right? The prohibition, we'd been out of that for a while, and all these issues were still lingering in the lodge. Issues like gambling and whatnot. So when you read the proceedings, you see him getting involved in these issues. He also got very involved in the Masonic trial process, which probably wouldn't surprise you, to try to help make that just a much more fair and open process than it was at the time. Some of his accomplishments even came after he was Grand Master. When he was governor of California in 1947, he took on this project of creating the Columbia State Park. He felt like the state needed a park to tell the history of the gold rush in California. And he wasn't having a lot of luck, so he turned to his friends and allies to help them. And one of them was the Grand Lodge of California. And of course, some of you might know that story, but today we have the Columbia State Park. And it was really created out of the sheer will of Governor Warren. And he leaned into his fraternal associations. It was the Grand Lodge of California, the Native Sons of the Golden West, who really invested money and made that park what it is today.
Yeah, I've been to Columbia Lodge many times, or I've been to Columbia as well as Murphy's many times, and I've been inside the Columbia Lodge lodge, we actually did with dispensation did a degree
Yeah.
in that lodge. And I know a lot of
Yeah,
other
and
lodges
that was
have done
Earl
as well.
Warren's baby. That was his project to make that state park happen.
Interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I believe that is all. I'll turn it back to Roberto. I believe that's all the questions.
Thank you, Worshipful Gary.
Mhm.
Thank you again, very Worshipful Allan, for agreeing to be here this evening with us and sharing your research and knowledge with us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Before we retire this evening, I'd like to, of course, give special thanks to all the help and support to our team in the back end, which made this and all our previous presentations possible. Worshipful brothers Marty Kusing, Gary Stevens, and David Jolliffe. Also brothers Barry Kopp for coordinating things with the very Worshipful Allan, and our chaplain, Aidan Cotter. Thank you, gentlemen, for making this possible. And again, a job well done. Brethren, thank you again for being here tonight with us. We look forward to having you join us again for our future speakers. As mentioned previously, we will be having a break during what we call our dark months for the summer, the months of June and July. We will be at rest and hope to resume again in August. As a reminder, tonight's presentation was recorded and will be made available to everyone who registered. The link will be emailed to you. Please feel free to share with others. The recording can also be accessed on Burlingame Lodge's Facebook page. In closing, Brother Aidan Cotter, chaplain, would again lead us in prayer. Brother Aidan.
Thank you, Worshipful. Brothers, Supreme Grand Master, ruler of heaven and earth, now that we are about to separate and return to our respective places of abode, wilt thou be pleased so to influence our hearts and minds that we may each one of us practice out of the lodge the great moral duties which are inculcated in it, and with reverence study and obey the laws which thou hast given us in thy holy word. Amen.
So mote it be. Thanks again, brethren, for joining us here tonight. Brethren, stay well, stay safe, and have a great evening. Good night, my brothers.